welcome to the first episode of Dark Crossroads, a podcast where we talk about all things true crime. I am your host, Roxanne Fletcher. When I came up with the idea for Dark Crossroads podcast, it was with the goal to be able to offer the chance for these stories to get heard and hopefully help families get answers and the closure that they deserve. So with that said, I'm going to dive into our very first episode. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the New Bedford Highway Killer. Between the months of April to September of 1988, a monster haunted the town of New Bedford, Massachusetts. Women's bodies were all found along highways outside of New Bedford. The first victim was found in July of 1988, and the last known victim was found on April 24th, 1989, off the Interstate 195. To date, there has been no conviction in any of the murders of the New Bedford women. The victims of this deserved more. They had lives, they had families, and they had futures, and they deserve justice and to be remembered for who they were and not just memorialized because of these horrible circumstances. Between the 11 victims, they had 15 children. 2 of the 11 bodies were never found. All of the women were linked to either sex work and or drug use or both. Some of them were last seen in areas linked with both of these, and at least 6 knew each other. Many believe that because of this, the case didn't receive the attention that it deserves. It is important to note that this is 1988, where DNA was brand new and rarely used, or even thought to be used. Police reports were handwritten or prepared on a typewriter. The remains were also outdoors for months before being discovered. The crime scenes had also been contaminated by animals and the elements, which possibly washed away any valuable evidence. In some of the cases, the clothing was on the bodies, while in others, it was found at or near the remains. Serial killers were also not as common or understood, and the detectives on this case had never dealt with one before. It took months to years or more to identify some of these women. The media was not very interested in the case due to the nature of the women's backgrounds. Detectives were not as invested at first, but when the realization came that they were dealing with a serial killer in their own town, evidence shows that they put effort and time into trying to solve this. Many of the witnesses that surfaced were involved in the same crowd as the victims, which made that the result of them having distorted memories, so they couldn't really link or trust any of their memories to the case. There was no solid evidence linking a single person to the killings. There were so many different people being examined, whose names eventually became very public, that people on the street and members of the media began joking throughout the town of who was going to be the suspect of the day. So now I'm going to get into the timeline of all of this, including the victims, the possible suspects, and when everything happened. So starting in 1988, we're going to start with a man named Kenneth Ponte. Kenneth Ponte was born and raised in New Bedford. He had 2 siblings, and his mother, Helena Ponte, still lives in the city. His late father, Joseph, was a former veterans agent for the city of New Bedford. Ponte is described as an eccentric character, a reformed heroin addict who cleaned up his act, went to law school, and made a living with lower-level civil and criminal cases. He was known for his rumpled suits and his heavy cocaine abuse, though he was designated as a deputy sheriff after donating to the Bristol County Sheriff's election campaign, earning him a badge and, despite his record, a gun. The girls on the street told stories about his paranoia, how he would bring them to his house, bolt the doors, and wouldn't let them leave. He didn't seem violent, just really strange is how he is described. But that didn't stop the girls from going with him. and none of the girls considered pressing any charges because he did, after all, give them coke and didn't seem interested in sex. Quote, Kenneth Ponte, in April 3rd, allegedly threatens a man with a gun. So this is important to remember for later, when other stuff starts going down. So one of the women who is one of the victims, her mother stated that her daughter had once given her telephone to Ponte in the event she needed to be reached. Ponte admitted to having represented this woman in April 1988, shortly before she disappeared, when she accused another man of raping her. At the age of 60 years old, Kenneth was found bloated and dead by overdose in January 2010 on 2 stacked mattresses in his home in New Bedford. The Bristol County District Attorney's Office has discounted foul play as a cause of death in his case. Again in 1988, another suspect surfaces. His name is Daniel Tavares Jr. Daniel is serving time in prison for the murder of his mother, and while serving his time in prison, he sent a threatening letter to one of the prison staff, indirectly claiming responsibility for the highway killings. He did live in New Bedford and had knowledge of where another murdered woman, Gail, had been buried. She had been found within a mile from his home. He also was convicted of 2 recent killings of brothers and was eventually convicted in 2015 of the murder of Gail. So now we go to the first known victim. Christine Montero, a 19-year-old woman, last seen in New Bedford late May 1988. Her body, to this day, has never been found. Her mother was engaged to a Dartmouth police officer. She had a young child and was also known to be a heroin and cocaine user. In between May and June, after the first victim has been found, an unknown letter is sent to the Bristol County District Attorney's Office. Ronald Pena said his office received an anonymous letter 2 weeks before the second woman was found from a person who said he might have witnessed one of the killings and predicted that a body would be found on Route 88. It is stated by Ronald Pena, the person who sent the letter said they had information and had seen what they believed to be a person who may have been doing these killings. He stated, I don't know if that is accurate, but what they did say is if we found a body on Route 88, then it would confirm their sighting. The letter did also happen to be explicit, but it is not shared with the public as of right now. He did state that there has never been a body found on Route 88. He said it sounded very good, but it just didn't fit. And he said that if it did fit, if a person had been found, the person who sent the letter would come forward. So in June, Marilyn Roberts, a 34-year-old woman, last seen in New Bedford, June 1988. She is the second woman that went missing, and her body, to this day, also has never been found. She was the daughter of a retired New Bedford police officer. She had a supportive family who consistently tried to help her with her heroin addiction. Her family originally believed that she had moved to the West Coast to live with a relative, but they later learned that she had not been in touch with any of her relatives. This was in April, and in June her family cited her. With the sighting of her, they decided not to do a missing persons report anymore, so it kind of calmed their nerves because she was known to kind of come and go for long periods of time. But they eventually reported her missing again in December of 1988 after they heard a possible serial killer was in the area. She also was neighbors with the previous victim, which there's a few theories around that, but in 1998, her mother stated, "We're trying to get on with our lives. I just wish I had a grave to visit. I really don't know what happened to her, and it looks like I never will." Now we're moving on to July 3rd. Deborah Medeiros was found on Route 140 North in Freetown by a woman who stopped to relieve herself. Deborah had disappeared in May 27, 1988, and was identified in December of 1988. She was a 30-year-old woman last seen in New Bedford, Mass. On May 1988 after ending a relationship with her boyfriend. She was the first body in the series to be found. She was found on July of 1988, about 30 feet from the road on northbound Route 140 in Freetown, Mass. The woman who had stopped to relieve herself was doing it on Sunday, 4th of July weekend. She came upon the partially clothed, unrecognizable corpse, a bra wrapped around its neck. And investigators who soon arrived on the scene could tell that the body had been there for months from the decomposition. Now it's July 30th. Nancy Lee Pava is found on the westbound side of Interstate I-95 in Dartmouth, about 1.5 miles east of the Reed Road exit by two men on motorcycles. She disappeared on July 7th, 1988, and was identified in December of 1988. Nancy Pina Palva, a 36-year-old woman, last seen in New Bedford, July 7th, after walking in the South End in the early hours. She was a mother of two girls. Nancy had graduated high school and went to a very good secretarial school in the area, but dropped out in the 1970s. She was married at 19 and had a daughter named Jill. She divorced and had a second daughter, Jolene. Nancy was also a grandmother, with her daughter pregnant at 15, who had two kids. Her family says she was a very supportive mother and grandmother. Her family denies that she was ever involved in prostitution, and there was no arrest records for solicitation. But they do say that she was in a very difficult domestic violence situation with heroin dealer named Frankie. She had been to rehab for heroin in the past and NA meetings. Detectives start to take this case seriously when her boyfriend starts reporting her missing at the police station. See, police knew him well as he had many run-ins with the law in the past, and he had been dealing with a domestic violence situation, and the police had been to his house dealing with that. According to some, an argument between Nancy and Frankie ensued at the Whispers Pub, a place known for cocaine and drug use. Frankie ordered Nancy to leave the bar, which she decided to leave. An acquaintance later said that she saw Nancy walking up the street toward her house around 7 p.m. with tears in her eyes. It did happen to be raining at the time, and this was the last time anybody saw Nancy alive. So now we go to September. A New Bedford detective named John notices that a number of drug-addicted women are suddenly going missing, and he decides to contact the district attorney's office to set up a meeting to discuss these cases. And this is when the police start taking this seriously. They start using their resources and doing what they can to figure out what is going on. On October 10th, Kenneth Ponte moves to Florida. Clearly, this raises some red flags because In the midst of all of this, he's one of the main suspects, and he just decides to get up and go to Florida. So now we're going to November 8th. Deborah Greenlaw DeMello. She is found off the eastbound Reed Road ramp of Interstate I-95 by a state highway crew. She had walked away from a prison work release program with charges of prostitution. She had been doing this program. This was in Rhode Island, and she walked away on June 18th, 1988, and was later identified in December of 1988. Her remains were concealed by trees, and her clothes were strewn in the nearby tree branches. She was found with some of the belongings of Nancy Pava, which also kind of made them realize that these are connected. Deborah was 35 years old, and she had a 15-year-old daughter and two boys, aged 8 and 3. Deborah's daughter would later raise her children as her own, and has stated that they will never give up the search for her. On November 29th, Dawn Mendez found on the westbound Reed Road ramp off Interstate 195 by a search dog. She disappeared September 4th, 1988, and was identified days later. She was 25 years old and was last seen on September 4th, 1988, walking from her South End apartment to a family christening party. She was one of 10 children in the Mendez family. She was a mother of a 5-year-old boy, and she had a history of prostitution and drug use too. In 1989, her mother described the last time she saw her. She said that she was so thin. She stated that the drugs were controlling her. She also states that her daughter's boyfriend had a spell on her, and if she did not go out and make the money to get the drugs, there were consequences with him. Now, December 1st, Deborah Lynn McConnell is found on Route 140 northbound in Freetown by a search dog also. She was last seen by her family in May of 1988 and was identified in March of 1989. She was 25 years old and was last seen by her father in New Bedford, May 1988, at a cemetery after they had just buried his wife and her mother. The family ended up growing worried when she did not end up going to her 10-year-old daughter's birthday party. December 10th, Rochelle Clifford DeParala, sorry if I'm saying this wrong, is found in a gravel pit along Reed Road, about 2 miles from the Interstate 195, by people riding ATVs. She was last seen in late April of 1988 and was identified in December of 1988. Rochelle is the only person not found directly off of the highway. Rochelle, a 28-year-old woman, was a mother of 2. She did happen to be a witness in a case against a man named Roger, who she did claim raped her. He was being brought up by police on weapons charges also. She was last seen with Nancy Pava's boyfriend, though, which is kind of a twist in this story. He was an ex-convict, but he was cleared in both of these deaths, but it did also raise some red flags when they saw the connection. Now we're to 1989. Some new suspects have entered the scene here, and they're known as the Sensi brothers. They lived an hour away from these dump sites. One of the brothers was convicted of one rape, but he'd been accused of a string of extremely violent and sadistic rapes and attempted rapes over a number of years. This same brother is 40 years old and is now serving a life sentence in Georgia after he was convicted of rape, sodomy, and 3 aggravated assaults in 1989. In one case, he reportedly broke into a woman's home in Fayette County, Georgia, put a pillowcase over her head, and attempted to rape her. In the most heinous attack, this man reportedly forced his way into a church and raped the minister's wife. He was convicted for an attack in Georgia, but he's been back to Massachusetts before then. He'd been arrested for burglary in Massachusetts. The other brother is convicted of just one murder of a prostitute in 2012, but court records show that this brother had a history of violence against women that stretches for more than a decade. In cases dating back to 1996, the second brother was charged with beating a woman known to be a prostitute, allegedly raping and trying to strangle a woman who allegedly raping a girl under the age of 16. In each case, the charges were either reduced or dropped when the women did not appear in court, which blows my mind. This second brother is being held in Worcester County Jail on rape and attempted murder charges for allegedly sodomizing a female friend in March 2007, then trying to smother her with a pillow. This woman did happen to escape. The reason that these men are linked is because they both have links to the area in Massachusetts, and they're both known for their heinous acts against women. Another suspect that has kind of popped up is Lionel DeSouza. He was convicted and deported after 1989 for a vicious attack and rape with a pipe and bottle at Fort Taber in New Bedford. He was never interviewed by the grand jury, and he had never had any DNA taken. So because of that, he's kind of just slipped through the cracks. And he was only attached or became a suspect because of his one link to New Bedford. Now we're to January 18th, continuing on the timeline. We're going back to Kenneth Ponte here. He is arraigned in New Bedford Superior Court. A grand jury ends up handing him an indictment on the April 1988 gun charges. This is what I told you to remember for later. Now he's starting to get his charges filed against him, and he's going through all the court stuff. So he's getting the indictment for the gun charges. March 28th, Robin L. Rhodes found along Route 140 southbound in Freetown, another by a search dog. She was believed to have disappeared sometime in March or April of 1988, but she was soon identified after being found. She went by the name Bobby Lynn, which I love. So it was Bobby Lynn Rhodes. She was 28 years old and last seen in New Bedford, April 1988, by her mother. She was found March 28, 1989, along the route which I had just described. She had a young child, but she also, like all the others, was addicted to heroin and cocaine. While she was never involved in prostitution, she did hang out with kind of a sketchy crowd. She hung out at the same saloons and in the same company as Clifford, Mendez, and Pava. She was good friends with Santos also. So they're starting to see that all these women not only hang around the same people, but they kind of know each other. They're in the same group of people. Now, in the same month, March 31st, Mary Rose Santos is found along Route 88 in Westport by two boys. She was last seen July 16th, 1988. She was soon identified after her body was found. She was 26 years old and last seen in New Bedford, dancing at the old quarterdeck lounge in the early morning hours. Her husband had dropped her off earlier near the downtown bus station, and witnesses say that she had planned to walk to a friend's apartment nearby before it went missing. A beer bottle was found among her remains. Santos was a mother of two, but she also was a heroin addict. She was friends with Clifford, Pava, and Santos. Her son was 6 years old when she was murdered, and he did happen to speak out 19 years later about her death. He says that earlier that day, he was home playing video games. He states that his mother, about to go out for the night, had asked him for a kiss. He remembers telling her no, because he was busy playing his game. Mr. Santos said his parents had just reconciled after a brief separation and were planning to renew their vows. His mother had gone out looking for a wedding dress that day before she went missing. April 24th, Sandra Botello is found along Interstate 195 in Marion by a state highway crew. She had disappeared August 11th, 1988, and was identified soon after she was found also. Sandra was 24 years old, and she was last seen in New Bedford August 11th, 1988, after leaving her apartment. Found April 24th, she was a college dropout, and she was also involved with the prostitution and the drug use around the area. She did have 2 sons. They both were aged 4 and 6. In May of 1989, another suspect surfaces. His name is Anthony DeGrazia, and he went by the nickname Flatnose. He was identified by a locally known New Bedford prostitute by means of a picture provided by a young, inexperienced detective. The prostitute, who described the assailant as having a flat nose, never named DeGrazia as a positive suspect, but stated that he looked like the man who assaulted her. He was later accused of 17 rapes and assaults on several prostitutes. Based on allegations, DeGrazia was questioned, arrested, and charged with the 17 rapes and assaults, while also being investigated as a suspect in the 9 murders along area highways. He was interviewed by the grand jury, but was never charged. It is stated by certain police officers that he was a key suspect in this case. After 15 months of incarceration and 18 court appearances, he was released on bail in January 1990. He was then briefly rearrested for allegedly uttering threats to the DA, Ronald Pena, again, for wrongful prosecution and imprisonment. He again posted bond, but was then later found dead at his girlfriend's house under a picnic table. His death was ruled a suicide. Authorities investigated his possible connection to the New Bedford prostitute murders. He was known to frequent sex workers in the area and had been accused of numerous crimes. But it all ended when he committed suicide in the 90s. So 1990, we're entering August. This is August 17th. Kenneth Ponte is arraigned on a single count of murder. Ponte entered a plea of absolutely not guilty in quotation marks and posted a $50,000 bond. A grand jury indicted New Bedford attorney Kenneth Ponte, 40 years old, in the murder of Rochelle Clifford DeParala, who had been beaten to death. Ponte had a checkered past, including the drug use and the prior incident involving the previous stated Rochelle. Bristol County District Attorney Ronald Pena suggested that Ponte had murdered DeParala because she was allegedly planning to expose his drug activities, which I have to just say, side note, I could see that a possibility. The lead investigator noted, unfortunately, he chose not to speak to us about his relationship with the homicide victims. It forced us to spend a lot of time and efforts following up on various leads and bits of information. If he had cooperated with the police, it would have benefited him in the long run. In 1991, July 29th, the district attorney dropped murder charges against Ponte, citing lack of evidence. The following year, remaining drug and assault charges were dropped, and the New Bedford case eventually went ice cold. Ponte had several run-ins with the law. He was arrested at least twice for possession of crack cocaine, and in 1997, Ponte was disbarred for using a $12,000 of a client's insurance settlement for personal use. He then resurfaced in the news in May 2009 in two separate incidents. Police dug up the driveway and patio of his house with a backhoe, but were unable to find any evidence linking him to any crime. On the morning of May 15th, Ponte was arrested for shoplifting and was found with 4 cans of sardines and a block of cheese stolen from a Price Right store. In 2004, he was charged with animal cruelty for neglecting his cat. Now we're going to go on to another suspect that kind of has surfaced around the years 1992 and 1993. 3 prostitutes were slain and disemboweled with an instrument that was a knife in Lisbon, Portugal, by an unknown serial killer that was dubbed the Lisbon Ripper, while 2 further prostitutes were shot dead on the opposite shore of the Tagus River in the same time period. In March 1993, 2 detectives of the Portuguese police traveled to New Bedford to gather information on the highway killings, while 2 agents of the FBI traveled to Lisbon following a hypothesis that the string of crimes on both sides of the Atlantic could have been committed by the same individual. New Bedford has a sizable Portuguese community, and many of the highway victims were of Portuguese ancestry. The Lisbon murders were also linked to 4 similar killings that took place in Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and the Czech Republic, all countries bordering Germany, between 1993 and 1997. Now, there's this theory that is out there that the Lisbon Ripper had become a long-haul truck driver to make it easy for him to not be discovered. I see this as a possibility, something to keep your mind open to. Moving on, in 2011, a 21-year-old man applied to participate in the Portuguese edition of a reality show titled Secret Story, where participants try to guess each other's secrets while concealing their own. The secret he went in with was that his father, Jose Pedro Guedes, was the Lisbon Ripper. Guedes was 46 years old and was eventually arrested and confessed to 3 slayings, but he couldn't be prosecuted because the statute of limitations in Portugal was 15 years from the time that you murdered somebody to where you were getting charged, and the last murders had ended in 2008. Guedes could still be prosecuted for the 2000 murder of a prostitute in Portugal and similar murders in Germany and the surrounding countries, where he resided in the 90s. It is unknown, however, if he ever resided in the United States. He eventually was tried for the murder of the prostitute in Portugal in 2013, but was found that it could not be proven due to lack of evidence, and he eventually was released. The sentence did note that several details given by him about that prostitute murder and the Lisbon murders were inaccurate. Another person that has surfaced that has caught the eye of investigators is a man named Neil Anderson. He was identified as being involved with assaulting and raping prostitutes from Weld Square area during the highway killings. He lived near Weld Square area at the time and was known to police. He was charged with rape and intent to rape for an incident in Dartmouth, and he was indicted in an additional rape that took place in the reservation in Fall River. He was interviewed by the grand jury, but interest in him slowly faded away. He did happen to be convicted in 1994 for aggravated rape, and completing his sentence was held at Massachusetts Treatment Center in Bridgewater for a year, while prosecutors attempted to try to convince the court that he was sexually dangerous, and on the streets, he would do it again. The court released him, though, on September 20th, 2006. On August 16th, 2007, he was accused again of robbing the Northeastern Savings Bank in Easton, and on September 6, 2007, robbing the Slade Bank in Swansea. Anderson is also a suspect in the robberies of banks in Raynham, North Attleboro, and East Providence, Rhode Island. Another theory that has come up is, well, let me start with New Bedford is known for being the whaling capital of the United States. They are known for the fishing there, and they did at one point used to be the wealthiest town in the United States because of this. But it has gone downhill recently. Given the time period of these women's disappearances, some people have come up with a theory that the killer could be a man who worked on a fishing vessel based in New Bedford, but would come and go. It could have been committed by, someone from a migratory commercial fishing fleet that visited New Bedford between March and September before returning to another area of the United States or world or whatever on this boat. I think this is a good theory. And I think it also gives us an idea that we should probably look elsewhere for similar cases, situations, time period of people going missing and try to connect them. Because if this is so, I don't think he's only doing it in New Bedford. If he's getting on a boat and going to San Diego or somewhere else, they should try to probably widen their connection. And I don't know, I think that's something people should be open to too. Another person that has come up is he's called the Missouri Man. So during the investigation, a Missouri man who was once arrested on fugitive and auto theft charges by Attleboro police was examined as a suspect. He had bragged to a prison guard in Missouri that he killed the woman while living out east. But he eventually was rolled out after police determined his story was a ruse, just to be brought back out east to visit his ex-wife. How sweet. So I'm just going to put it out there. Who do you guys suspect is the killer? A few of these got my mind wandering a little bit. And I feel like it got my little detective hat going. But honestly, it could be anybody. It could be somebody that's not even on this list. It could be somebody out there who is still going about their daily life. Or it could be somebody on this list, and it could take just one person to put in the right tip of something that they've held all these years to get this guy. I think that something that we have to take away from this is to keep our minds open, but also be aware of your surroundings. And this is for everybody. So if anybody has a tip, if anybody knows anything from this time area, if anybody in New Bedford or has connections to New Bedford, remembers anything weird, anything at all, please contact the police. Please contact somebody. Your tip can be anonymous. If you contact Crime Stoppers of the United States of America, you can leave an anonymous tip via text or phone call. You can call them at 1-800-222-TIPS. It is completely anonymous, and they will follow up on this tip. One little thing I think could help break this case. It could be somebody on this list. It could be some other person that they haven't even thought about. Another place that you can contact is the New Bedford Police Department. You can contact the Massachusetts State Police or call 1-508-505-INFO. There has been a book written about this case called Shallow Graves, and I'm definitely putting it out there that people should read this book along with doing as much research as they can, because if we can find this person, we would give so many people, families, loved ones, children, closure. There would be grave sites that people could eventually go and visit. There could be memorials that people could finally have in peace. They can look at the person and know that justice is served. If just one tip comes in, this will all be worth it. So with all that said, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. We will be definitely coming on next week. We're so excited to be launching this. We started with a very big case, I feel like, but go big or go home, right? So rate us, visit the website at www.darkcrossroadspodcast.com. You can visit us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We're trying to start a little TikTok and YouTube, but slow rolling. And you can also find us on any podcast platform. I'm your host, Roxanne Fletcher. Thanks for listening, and please join us next week for some more true crime.